Hello everyone. Welcome to the next in our series on the examination of the mystery of southern France. Today we are going through a massive amount of seemingly disconnected material that does in some way connect, and it's I've got many sheets of paper in front of me, and I'm going to try to just run through highlights of what we're going to talk about and let you look in more deeper into things that you want to look at on your own. We'll be looking into some stories of treasure in the area that will lead to Otto Rahn in the 1930s and the interest of Nazi Germany in southern France. We'll look at some information on the Celts and the Gauls, the Vikings and the Normans, the Cagots, how that relates to southern France. We'll get into a little bit of a general overview of what might be called secret societies, Freemasons, Philadelphians, the AA, St. Martin, and a few other ideas as a look to show you just how encompassing this story has been and in fact still is. If I cough or clear my throat a few times while I'm doing this, I've had a slight asthma attack before I began reading this. My wood stove is not the best, and a bunch of smoke came out of it as I was trying to get the fire started, and so you may notice I'm taking extra breaths during the presentation here, and that's what it is, so you know why I'm breathing a bit poor. So let us begin with some old stories of treasure in the area. And it goes as far back as the book called Geography by Strabo, who lived between 64 BC and 23 AD. And he tells of 300 tons of gold and silver bullion that was recovered by the Romans from Celtic temples at Narbonne, which is of course the main city in the southern ode of France. Strabo claims that this particular gold bullion was actually either an accumulation of Celtic sacred offerings or was a Celtic loot that they had taken from the Greek treasuries at Delphi, which it's claimed they sacked in 278 BC. The claim goes, according to Strabo, that the Romans somehow lost all of this bullion that they took from France during Caesar's Gallic Wars, and it was never recovered. So right away, 2,000 years ago, there were already Roman writers presenting information about a great gold treasure being uncovered in this area of southern France. It's as if this story had been part of a local history and myth for, well, almost ever. Otto Rahn, who we will come to, recounts in his book The Crusade a very similar story, a little more detailed. He writes of an ancient lake that's dark green waters and is surrounded by sheer cliff walls. He called it the Lake of Trouts, or the Lake of Sins. He claimed it was situated between the mountains of St. Bartholomew, which is opposite Mont Segur and known locally as Thabor, and the Pic du Solirac, which is St. Bartholomew's twin summit. In this lake, Druids are claimed to have thrown gold, silver, and precious stones in the time before Jesus. And again, this treasure is said to be the famous treasure of the Temple of Delphi, in which, in 279 BC, Brennus, the Celtic chief, is supposed to have led 200,000 soldiers into Greece specifically to get this treasure. However, upon returning and when settling in the Montségur area, people began dying in numbers of an inexplicable ailment. Again, this is the story, this is the myth, right? A man could be healthy in the morning and then could be dead by nightfall. Never before had such a malady struck this area. So the Druids used their divining properties in the flights of birds, that the people would not get well unless the treasure that was taken was disposed of, and they suggested that all the mountain people throw away all the treasures they'd taken from Delphi into the subterranean divinities and mistresses of life and death. So, on chariots drawn on stone wheels, the mountain people brought their riches to the lake and plunged them into the fathomable depths. Then the Druids traced a magic circle around the lake. Immediately all the fish died, and the waters once green turned black. At this moment the people were cured of their terrible affliction. The legend says that all the gold and silver will belong to whoever can break the magic circle, but it warns, as soon as the finder touches the treasures, he will succumb to the same malady as the old mountain folk and presumably perish. We can talk more about the story as we go along. We bring it up more to Saunierre's time. In 1830, a man was out walking in Garrigou and found a gold ingot weighing 20 kilos. And just 30 years later, in 1860, near Bézieux, another man found a gold bar made of partially smelted Arabic coins that weighed almost 50 kilos. Saunierre, in fact, was investigated by a local gendarme, policeman, on suspicion of trafficking gold in Spain, and there is also a report from Spanish police on this matter. But even though gold may have been discovered, and gold is part of the story, I still believe that any references in the story are not to real gold. They are to alchemic references of the third state of Rubedo. A reminder that a author, Jean-Pierre Jacques-Auguste de la Boissière Rochefort, long name, a French historian, wrote a book in 1803, but it wasn't published till 1832, and it was called Voyage au Rennes Le Chateau. The book detailed a treasure guarded by a devil close to Chateau de Blanchefort. He claimed the treasure was 19.5 million pieces of gold. His book described that the area around Rennes was very similar to Arcadia. If you go through the whole story, you'll see it's very hermetic and alchemic elements through the whole story. But it states that on a nice sunny day, the devil put the gold on display, where it was spotted by a young shepherdess who lived close by. But when she returned with her parents, the treasure had disappeared. A sorcerer was called in, and he said he would help find the treasure and would demand half of it, and needed 400 to 500 francs to prepare his journey. The wizard warned that it was going to be a fight against the devil, and when he calls them, they must come to his aid. All of the villagers promised to be brave. So the sorcerer went out to find the devil, and was attacked. He yelled out, "Help me, help me," but no one came to his aid. The sorcerer escaped, covered in dust, and tells the villagers that he was abandoned by them. He said they were so close, and had they come to his help, they would have had the treasure for sure. He reproached them for their cowardness, and then simply left for the village of Lemieux. Rochefort then describes that the Marquis de Fleury, who owned Blanchefort, threatened the villagers for violating his territory, which of course linked to actual events in the 1600s. So again, this idea of treasure and the devil and a battle for it and all these things had existed in this area long before Saunierre ever came to Rennes Le Chateau. And interestingly, Rochefort, the same writer, had written a book before this called The Lovers to Eleanor, with on its title page said, "Et in Arcadia ego." So we can see that this area is an area that Saunierre is just sort of a modern pinpoint, a modern marker to something that's been going on for a long time. I guess what we should look into now what might be classified as the first Indiana Jones. That's a really good way of describing him. And that is Otto Rahn. And Otto Rahn is a very difficult man to figure out. He definitely did work as a member of the SS during the 1930s, but it seems like he was forcibly conscripted, certainly didn't want to be there, and as we'll find out, was either murdered by them, committed suicide, or pulled an Elvis and faked his own death. Either way, it's a very important part of our story. After the time, even during the time of Saunierre and after, many occultists, and we'll see that the occultists and the occultic organizations of the day were very much connected with this story. But many occultists of the time came to believe that the tomb of Christian Rosenkreuz, the story that I told you about in the last information that came out in the 1600s, and the Holy Grail were, if not the same, they were closely connected. And a very good book that discusses Rahn and his connection to this was written by Colonel Howard Buchner, called Emerald Cup, Ark of Gold, The Quest of SS Lieutenant Otto Rahn of the Third Reich. The claim is that Otto Rahn, who spent many years searching either on behalf of himself, on behalf of the Nazis, on behalf of some other party, did actually find something in the caves around Mont Segur. It's believed that it was not the Holy Grail. Some believe what he found was actually the tomb of Christian Rosenkreuz, or whatever the tomb of Christian Rosenkreuz represents. What it's claimed, according to rumor and people who were there at the area, was that he found a huge chamber, which was known to the local mountain people as the Cathedral, because it served as a meeting place for the ancient Cathars. In the main hall was a great stalagmite known as the Tomb of Hercules. And the Tomb of Hercules is interesting because of the implication that the god is buried within the mountain, just as Rosenkreuz is buried within the mountain of Albi Genius. Of course, Albi, is linked to the Cathars, right? One of the myths has Hermes with a magic stone that falls from heaven that had strange electromagnetic properties, which has always been associated with the Holy Grail and something that Hercules was possessed, this heavenly stone, and he also had a special gold cup that he carried. So it is possible that the entire Grail story is also linked in some way to the myth of Hercules. Remember too that the Ark of the Covenant is said to be a container made of gold, which also had strange electromagnetic properties. So it's again strange that all of these seemingly separate things might be pointing in the same direction. Let us look into a little bit of Rahn and some of what he was doing. Let's call him, what's the best way of describing him? I mean, again, I've got pages that are not fully laid out in order, so I kind of have to jump around to try to present the story. But you can easily go look up on the internet Otto Rahn and look up some information on him. I know he had been searching for many years since the 1920s for various occult secret information, particularly the Grail, and particularly his belief that not only that the Cathars had the Grail, but the Cathars were a very special organization. He knew that war was coming in the 1930s, and he believed that instead of Germany in Europe, he believed instead of that, Germany and all of Europe should be transformed into a race of pure ones, or Cathars. And his entire search was focused on understanding the Grail. He wrote a book, what was it called? His first book was something on the Crusade of the Grail or something, and the next one was on something like the Rise of Lucifer. And I'll get into all of this. Buchner, the writer, has claimed that Otto Rahn felt there were actually two Grails. One was a cup, but the second was made of stone, and perhaps a collection of stone tablets containing the wisdom of the ages of ultimate truth, but in a language which no one would decipher, which sounds very similar to the Egyptian stories of the books of Thoth. In ancient times, the word gor meant precious stone, and al meant a styling or engraving tool which to write. Hence, you can say the word goral, or even grail, can mean a precious engraved stone, which, if you take that symbolism, that becomes very similar to the Emerald Tablet of Hermes, which again is a simplified idea of the books of Thoth. So it's very interesting that San Graal, which people like Henry Lincoln in his book really tried to put in this idea of holy blood, sang real, holy blood. But if we start taking this word in many different connotations, right, sang graal could thus also mean a holy precious stone. So this one word can easily be presented to answer whatever you want the Grail to be, or whatever you want the story of southern France to be about. Recall too that in the Jacob story, the stone that he sleeps on to have a vision was often referred to as a Grail stone. So thus in time, the entire story of the Grail links to the story of Jacob, which links to the story of Jacob's Ladder, which of course is a chapter I happen to be one of the final chapters of my book Falling for Truth that I'm reading right now. Again, there's curiosity. Who was Rahn really working for? Was he working for the Nazis? Was he working for himself? Was he working for another secret organization? Again, he has a very odd death in 1939 that we'll talk about. But his main assertion was that the Cathars did in fact have the Holy Grail, They kept it during the siege at Segur, and they hid it in the many caves on the mountain, and he spent his life looking for it. Rahn was, to put this into a little bit of context, Rahn had done a tremendous amount of research in the 1920s. I believe he became friends with Deodat Rocher, who was claimed to be the Cathar Pope in the 1920s, and they went on several excursions into the countryside, the two of them alone, into various caves, into various pieces of information. And it was Himmler, and we'll get to the sort of the Nazi occult period a little bit. Heinrich Himmler had come to understand him and immediately wanted him in the SS. And as Rahn had later commented, I like to eat, so I like to have food on my table, so it's a good idea to say yes. Rahn was an open homosexual. He was very much against the Nazi Party in many ways. He often traveled to other countries in Europe, attending what you might call non-fascist gatherings. So he was very disliked within the Nazi organization. In fact, in 1938, on one of his homosexual instances was found out, he was sent as punishment to work at, I can't remember if it was work at Dachau or work at Buchenwald concentration camp for 4 months as punishment. And something was, Rahn was so upset by what he had seen from this time that shortly thereafter, on February 28, 1939, he submitted his letter of resignation to the SS, writing, "Unfortunately, I must ask you to intervene with the Reichsfuhrer SS, which is Himmler, for my immediate discharge from the SS. The reasons that have led me to this resolution and this decision are so grave a nature that I can only explain them to you orally." On March the 13th, Rahn is considered to have been killed. Supposedly, after passing on this letter, members of the SS caught up to him and gave him an option of committing suicide or execution. So whether he was actually killed and murdered, whether he did actually commit suicide, or like we say, there is a possibility that that's presented by Christian Berdenack, that Rahn didn't die, but again pulled an Elvis, faked his death, became someone called Rudolf Rahn, who became Germany's ambassador to Italy, and looks almost exactly the same as Otto Rahn, has the same secretary that Otto Rahn used to have, and bizarrely in 1944, some giant, massive debt that apparently he owed to Heinrich Himmler was paid off by some unknown source. So there's some sort of bizarre story that continued on with this, but I'm just giving you the background of this to let you know that there's a really, really strange piece of information around it. So let's go into more of what he was looking into. Rahn's key book was called Lucifer's Hovedstund. I think it's Lucifer's Rising, I think is what it is in English. And it's written in a very ideological style, supposedly of his travels. Once he wanted information on the Grail, he traveled all the way from Iceland to Greece, all through Europe, on, of course, the SS dime in many cases, to, as you'll see, the occult part of Nazi Germany was quite huge. And I also want to point out as we get into this, because we're talking about a stage of history now, the Second World War and the lead up to it are so obviously full of misconceptions, of untruth, of, certainly there was something that happened. Certainly there was a great conflagration. There was a tremendous war that went on. There was something, but when you start digging into the foundations of any of it, of what went on, none of the foundations make any sense compared to the historical record. So I'm just working with some of the basic historical patterns and presentations in the story. That doesn't necessarily mean they're true. It doesn't necessarily mean they're correct, that you should believe them. I'm just laying out the information for you. You can take it wherever you want to go with this. But anyway, so he wrote this book called Lucifer's Rising. And what's interesting is that, and it was very clear, Rahn did not see Lucifer as being similar with Satan or the devil. And in fact, to Rahn, Lucifer as the light bearer uh, saw him as the Pyrenees Abilio, the Celtic Balenios, the Nordic Baldar, the Greek Apollo. And he claimed that these were all the luminous gods of the past, but all the luminous gods, this is in the 1930s, all the illumination, that they were all asleep. And Rahn's wish was to reawaken this great European dream of the light bearer, this great work of what he called the positive Lucifer. And like I say, he traveled all over the world to study ancient sites to understand this source of this light. And I would assume then trying to understand the opposing force, because when we talk about the group of Illuminati, we're claiming that this is a controlling group. This is a group that's dominating the dream and is manipulating the dream and manipulating humanity. And it's possible, like everything that the control element of this dream does is something natural in reverse, something of the way the dream is structured and in reverse. So it would make sense that they have managed to take what is quite possibly a positive thing. Max Eigen actually just had an entire video that he did, or almost an entire video, also on the concept of Lucifer and how it's highly likely, yes, a mistranslation. It's something that doesn't appear in that word doesn't appear in the early Hebrew Bibles. It shows up in the Christian text as being phosphorus, which is again light bearer in Greek, and moves through to eventually become the word we know it of as in more or less the late Latin and even into the early English translations. And that likely this term is something that is one of the main terms of biblical study that has been totally misunderstood, that it's somehow been linked to Satan. But he gave a really interesting description of how that could have come about, but that they're not the same thing at all. So anyway, Otto Rahn was on the same page, and that's part of what he was searching for. He was searching for not just the grail, but I guess a source of what he would call light, and a source of light that would rebring the Cathars back to life, you might say. Rahn was also very connected with René Nelly, who later founded the Center for Cathar Studies in Carcassonne. Like I say, Deodat Rocher, who was Rudolf Steiner's principal disciple, was the man who went exploring the caves with Rahn, and as well with Maurice Magre, who was the historian of the Pyrenees and a key member of the Masonic Society Polaris. They had a number of archaeological digs set up, again, in hopes of finding either the Gnostic Gospel of John, which is another thing that Rahn was searching for. Rahn felt that the main Cathar text was the Gnostic Gospel, the original Gospel of John, the one that had been in the later found in the Nag Hammadi fragments and linked to the Gnostics, but that the Cathars had this, and he was searching for this. Okay. So recall that, for sure, Nazi Germany is a place of occult focus. Two interesting authors, Preston Nichols and Peter Moon, the ones who had done the Montauk series, claimed that there had been an event that had happened in Germany in 1923, which was a massive time travel experiment where key members of the Thule group, which was sort of the originating factor, originating foundation people behind the formation of the Nazi Party, collaborated with Aleister Crowley's lodge, the Astrum Argentinium, the Order of the Silver Star of Illumination, and created a project called the Physium. This project, along with the Order of the Black Sun, was working with time travel. And it's very interesting because Elizabeth Van Buren, who wrote the book on Bug Arch, she claimed that World War II was a war of time, and that the Black Sun stood for the center of the galaxy. This project, Physium, was supposed to be an attempt to retrieve the Holy Grail from a past century and put it in the hands of the groomer of the Antichrist. They also wanted to get what's known as the Spear of Longinus, which is supposed to be a magical power source. But there was a mistake that happened in the experiment, and somehow there was a time rift. And again, this is just a story by Moon and Nichols. I'm just presenting it to you. That created a time rift that connected with the Philadelphia experiment in 1943. So not just the weird stuff of the Philadelphia experiment. You've got this link to Project Physicum supposedly with the Nazis, and there was this almost like intermingling of the two groups. We will see that the Philadelphia Society and the Chef de Biens were a key part of the Saunierre story, and we have the Philadelphia experiment, which is also quite bizarre. I'm going to leave you a couple of things just to think about before we get off Otto Rahn and move into the next bit of information about World War II that the occult Germany people don't know about. For example, one story is when the Russians finally took over Berlin, they came across about 1,000 Tibetan corpses in the eastern sector, dressed in German army uniforms, but with no insignia or rank. And supposedly a small Himalayan colony had been established in Berlin and Munich in 1926 of Tibetan monks, with one of its members being known as the man with the green gloves, said to have possessed the keys to the kingdom of Argatha. And this monk, for some reason, took a keen interest in the Nazi movement and gained notoriety by predicting how many party members would win seats in the Reichstag. And as such, Hitler began consulting him regularly and began bringing tremendous numbers of Tibetan, I guess you call them lamas or whatever you want to call them, Tibetan primitive knowledge people to be working in dark ritual and spells. This is one piece of information that's claimed to be there. There was the Nazis had been organizing several expeditions to Tibet, believing that there were entrances to the hollow earth there, that there were special knowledge preserved in Tibetan monastery archives or whatnot. Anyway, I don't want to go into a tremendous amount of detail, but I just wanted to let you know that there's a lot of this really interesting information. If you want to go into it, you can go into, of course, the Vril Society, founded by psychic Maria Orsek, and everything of what Vril is supposed to be, which is this kind of deeper energy that humans can connect to. And through the Vril was the claim of this contact with extraterrestrial beings, again, insight to the hollow earth, how to make flying discs. Interestingly enough, Nikola Tesla was a very close communicator with Orsek, and they wrote back and forth continually. And that there were many things in the Vril Society that Tesla understood from the standpoint of what you might call energy, or you could also say Vril being like chi or prana. But anyway, that's a bit of the story of Otto Rahn. I'll leave you with one piece of information. So after Rahn's death, we'll get you back here to southern France. But after Rahn's death, other high members of the Nazi of the SS had taken over the investigation of looking for things at Mount Segur. And so the claim goes is that something was actually found in 1944. And according to the story, I'll just have to read it. It was taken up by Otto Skorzeny, Germany's the chief of Germany's special troops. It's claimed that he did find the Grail on March the 16th, which of course is symbolically the day of the Cathar destruction at Mount Segur. It's claimed that at exactly high noon on March the 16th, a small German aircraft appeared. It flew over Mount Segur several times, dipping its wings. Then it used skywriting equipment and formed a huge Celtic cross in the sky, which was, of course, the sacred emblem of the Cathars. The plane then landed, picked up Skorzeny and his treasure. Supposedly, the treasure consisted of several things, including 1,000 gold coins, items believed to have come from the Temple of Solomon, which included gold plates and fragments of wood that had once made up the Ark of Moses, a gold-plated tablet, a candelabra with 7 branches, a small gold urn, a staff, a harp, a sword, innumerable gold plates and vessels, many small belts of gold, and a number of precious jewels, some which bore inscriptions, 12 stone tablets bearing pre-runic inscriptions, of which no expert could read, a silver cup with an emerald base made of what appeared to be jasper, 3 gold plaques on the cup were inscribed with cuneiform script in an ancient language. A large number of religious objects and types, precious stones in abundance of all shapes and size. Again, like with any story, it all has to be taken with a grain of salt. I mean, is this a real story or a hermeticized story, just a story of making something up? Recall too that what's also really odd is how many gold coins were found, particularly by the U.S. Third Army under George Patton in 1945. These massive amounts of gold and massive amounts of gold linked to Heinrich Himmler's Grail, what's called the Grail Fortress at Wewelsburg, right? There's of course several stories that the innermost circle of, because it was really Himmler's high point of Himmler's SS was built like Freemasonic, like knight, like a series of knights, and almost like a altar Knights Templar, and that supposedly again large members of these people, along with the treasure, along with the Holy Grail or whatever, was transported by submarine U-530 to their Antarctic base, which was known as the Emerald Cave, which includes a secret tunnel all the way into the inner Earth. Okay, so I had to share that part of the story with you because it is so unique and interesting, and perhaps you're going to want to look into that a bit more. But let's shift focus now. We've been talking for about 30 minutes, and we'll shift our focus back in the past a little bit. Now to a few of the older groups that infleshed this region. Now first you have the Celts, and of course when most people think of Celts, they think of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England, and the stone circles and etc. There are kind of 4 continued Celtic languages that have sort of moved to the present, that being Irish Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, Welsh, and Breton, along with 2 recent languages, right, Cornish and Manx. But they're all linked to the original Celtic language. But the Celts, what you might call Celts, and of course linking to Druids, they were in all through Europe. It wasn't like just linked to England, and they were certainly a key part of southern France. And there's a huge element of this Celtic language, this now almost Welsh Gaelic language that the priest at Rennes Le Chateau, I've forgotten his name off the top of my head now, Henry Boudet, was writing his book Cromlechs of Rennes Le Chateau. Right? He was trying to say that you have to take the English language and transform it onto the French landscape to understand what was going on. And so it's very interesting. He's linking it then to the time of the Celts and the time of so therefore the time before the French language existed in France. Bizarrely, I got an email just today from a gentleman who's been researching the Welsh language and how that language interlinks into many ancient, we'll call it civilizations, and he's sort of showing potentially a Welsh link to it all. So I'm going to be in contact with this person and see if I can learn more of what he's been researching, what he's been studying, and perhaps share that with you at a later time. But it interestingly, with that line of thought, the reason it's really important to me is that line of thought and this looking into the Celts and the Gauls is going to lead, I think, more to when I get to my final video that I make on this subject that are going to maybe help us understand what's really going on or what really went on in southern France. Understanding these old languages are a key part of understanding what happened in southern France. We would know this area of probably the southern France to be known as Gaul, and the people there as Gauls, but they were certainly Celts, right? And without going into tremendous detail on the Gaulians, you can look it up. But again, this name is going to be very, very important. And the Greek and Latin word for them was either Galatia or Gallia, or Galli, sometimes referring to Celtic, Gallia or Celtai. But they were generally called Galli. And this is again going to be these words are going to be very, very important. Galli, Gael, all of these things to deal with what's going on there. Now the Irish word, if you take the Irish word Gaul, it doesn't mean a person or inhabitant of Gaul, but it actually meant a foreigner, and often was used to describe the Vikings and later the Normans. And the entire region of that part was known as Gallia Narbonensis. Gallia Narbonensis. Some of you may already be seeing where I'm going with this. It'll be interesting to see how many are catching it, but I'm going to leave it for now. I just wanted to present where we're headed. Again, we have to also take in the understanding of the Vikings, because the Vikings are a part of this story. And again, the popular conception of Vikings differ completely from anything that starts to emerge from the archaeology or the written sources or their runes or anything else. Remember, the Vikings were presented by the Christian conquerors. So we don't really have information from the Vikings themselves. I mean, they weren't even called, of course, Vikings. Vikings is just an Old Norse word, a feminine noun that refers to an expedition generally overseas. Right? Vik is usually a creek or a small bay. And so they would not have called themselves Vikings. That's a name that's come to them beyond. We have no idea what they called themselves. And it's certainly that they're not the bloodthirsty, destructive force that likely was either presented either by Christian misunderstanding of their pagan beliefs, or presented in such a way to justify their killing and destruction of the area. The same with the myths. There's great Norse mythology, sagas, and literature, which gives a tremendous detail of their mythological heroes, of their teachings, of Odin and Thor and the Ragnarok and all this kind of things. However, most of this transmission, of course, would have all been oral at the time. And the texts that have come about are actually writings and transcriptions that Christian scholars at the time were the first ones to take down. And later it was a couple of Icelanders who took the texts and kind of sort of up what you might call updated them and tried to put them into historical context. But again, even the myths and the sagas and everything else that is classified as this is the old Viking Norse stories and beliefs, again, those come through the Christian conquerors. So all of it has to be taken with a grain of salt. All of it has to be taken again with, do they have the whole story? Even if they were presented the story by some of the local inhabitants that were sharing it with them, either willingly or not willingly, how much did they share? Did they share all of it? Did they share parts of it? Did they purposely misrepresent some of it? You have to keep this into consideration. So where does this bring us into our story of southern France? Well, that comes through the group known as the Normans, and the area of western France now known as Normandy. And that's been known since the 10th century. And the Normans are direct descendants of the Viking conquerors of the territory, who intermingled with the native Merovingian culture of original Franks and Gauls. Their name is, of course, directly from the Old Norse Naromar, which was Norsemen, and became the Normans. And the Duchy of Normandy was established in 911 AD. Isn't that interesting? 911. There's the date right there, the number right there in the formation of the Duchy of Normandy. And the treaty that created the Duchy of Normandy and put the Normans in charge of this part of France was signed at the chapel of St. Clair sur Epte, and it was between King Charles I of France and Rollo, the leader of the Norse. Because of it, high-ranking members of the Norse took that last name of the church, St. Clair, and took it as their own name. So St. Clair and Sinclair all were original founding, you might say, Norse parts of the signing of the treaty or parts of the conquering of that area of France. And this is important because it's the Sinclairs who later quickly moved and took over and began control of the Scottish Orkneys, and that can potentially take the story, if that's true, the stories of Henry Sinclair and Templar Knights and etc. moving over to North America. It then does mean too that the Templar Knights, the Templars, have always believed to have had their foundation either directly in southern France or in this area of Champagne, which links to the Grail country. But we now cannot leave the Normans out of the story, that it's quite possible that the Knights Templar, and in fact the Grail romances, come in some sort of lineage through the Norman conquerors of this part of France, which links them directly to the Viking culture of Norway. And so Norway and Scandinavia. And so are we actually looking at the Knights Templar go much further back and actually link then to Scandinavia and England, which would link to King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, as I kind of mentioned, the very similarities between the Templars and the Arthur and the Round Table. And so are we also looking at, again, a Gaelic, Welsh, Celtic base to maybe the Cathars and the Knights Templar and everything else? And I want to leave you with one other interesting piece of information, and that is, or a thing to think about. Why did the Allied armies of 1944 choose as their invasion point of Europe to be at Normandy, which was, to all of the sort of military experts at the time, would be considered one of the weaker choices for the attack? Was it somehow historically important? Was it somehow linking to the conquest of the Normans? Were they attempting to get pieces of information or hidden information or hidden resources that had been kept in Normandy? Were they again trying to recreate a historical moment that the Allied armies now wanted to be the official Normans who, and whatever the Normans and the St. Clairs had in their possession, that somehow energetically the Allied armies would have this by taking over Normandy? Keep all this in mind to see how all of these little seemingly, again, non-connected elements link together. The last weird group to mention, and that is known as the Cagots. And these are almost impossible to figure out who they are, other than they've been around for about 500 years in southern France and northern Spain. Sometimes they're called Agots in some reason, sometimes they're called Capots in the Languedoc. But they were a persecuted group, very much like the Jews in Nazi Germany. They were required to live in separate areas called categories, often far off the edge of any city. They were excluded from all social and political rights. They were only allowed to enter a church via a special, usually a very small door, of which if you go to some very old historic French churches, you'll find this little small door in the side of the church, and that's where the Cagots had to enter from. And they had to be in the service. There was a rail that separated them from the rest of the congregation. They had their own holy water stoup, and should the Urchrist be offered to them, it had to be given to them on a large wooden spoon, so the priest would not come in direct contact with them. They were forbidden to eat or drink from the cup or the plate of a non-Cagot, and they had to wear special clothes, often including wearing a goose foot attached to it. They were restricted only to the trades of carpenter, butcher, and rope maker. Thus they were treated the same as lepers, and for a while many historians thought maybe they were lepers, but this is not the case. See, that's the trouble. No historian even today can figure out who the Cagots really were. They didn't seem to be a specific ethnic group nor a religious group that could be identified. Some wrote at the time they had blonde hair and blue eyes, but others claimed that they were dark-skinned. One account of them said they either had no earlobes, or if they did, one ear was shorter than the other. So it seems like, though there were no real distinguishing physical features to tell them apart, that was the reason they needed to wear the special clothes. While they spoke the common language of the area, and it seems that they thought of themselves as Christians, and they did go to church, and they were allowed in the church, the difference, it seems, is they claimed to have descended from families identified as Cagots. Were these early Visigoths? Were they descendants of early Muslim invaders of Spain? Some suggest, of course, they were descendants of the Cathars. The first document that mentions them is in the 13th and 14th century, of course, just after the time of the Cathars and the Knights Templar, hence the suggestion there must be some sort of link. Another account of the time claims that they were called beings that fell from the sky and came out of nowhere. That also links to a very odd account around 800 AD where the Archbishop of Lyon, Agoband, claimed that the city was invaded by creatures sailing in aerial ships. During the French Revolution, the Republic made it clear that the Cagots were no different from any other citizen. They tried to make the Cagots equal with everybody else. And in their supporting of the Republic, right, the people who were taking over the monarchy, they stormed government offices, burned birth certificates in order to try to conceal their origins. But it seems like they were still kept track of by the local population, and whoever they were, the tradition of shunning this group lasted well into the Industrial Revolution. The goosefoot origin, though, is very interesting, and that may be a Norse myth. Berkta, which means bright or intelligent. She was the goddess of growing and the souls and of the souls of unborn babies. And two of her main items is the goosefoot and the golden spindle. Bertha herself was an excellent spinner and spent much time pushing the thread that she was often portrayed with a wide, flat foot. In fact, there's speculation that she's the original Mother Goose. As the spinner on the nights between Christmas and January the 6th, she went through every street and every village and town, looking through every window to make sure that the spinning was finished and had been done well. For the maidens who had taken care during her task, she left a gift of one of her own golden threads, or a thing full of extra fine flax. But for those who had found to be careless, their wheels were broken and their flax were spoiled. Thus, there she is. This Norse myth of Berkta is also linked to becoming a little bit the Christmas tradition of St. Nicholas. So again, this idea of them having to wear special badges, having to wear special clothes, but no one has any idea who the Cagots were. This shunning of them, again, lasts into the Industrial Revolution, and then it seems to all of a sudden begin to disappear, and it's like it's been forgotten. So who are the Cagots? No one has any idea. So let's shift focus for another last 15 or 20 minutes here. I know it's a very detailed talk, but I want to get all this out in one segment. Let's move into some secret societies for you. And one of the big questions is, where did Saunierre get his money from? We're bringing it back up into Saunierre's time. Where does Saunierre get his money from? Because we're talking in excess of, almost 1 million francs, and there is speculation that he was planning another giant round of building projects just before he died in excess of another 1 million francs. So where did his money come from? And again, nobody can be all that sure. I'm just going to be giving you an overview of this. And again, please go into it for yourself if you want to go into some of the detail. This is just to overview you. But it is. We do know for sure that he was given money by the widow of the Count de Chambord, Marie Therese of Austria, who died in 1883. But she gave Saunierre at least 3,000 French francs to restore his church. Well, why did she do this? Again, the suggestion is something to do with Saunierre's anti-republic, pro-monarchy speech that had got him suspended. But we do have to remember that she was connected very closely to the de Hautefort family, the descendant of the supposed starter of the person who created the secret, right? Marie de Hautefort. So their family and the Chambards are very, very close. She was also married into the Hapsburg family. And the Hapsburg family of Austria, they're linked with having the Spear of Destiny. They were very clearly one of the groups of people who were sending tremendous amounts of money into Saunierre's many bank accounts that he had all over Europe. So again, why are the Hapsburgs so interested in Saunierre and what he's doing? Why do the Hapsburg need to have the Spear of Destiny, which was one of the first things that Hitler wanted to get a hold of when he took over Austria? It's also for sure that Baron Saunierre's brother, Alfred, worked for the Marquis de Chefbienne. And the Chefbienne family were very close to the Countess de Chambord. They were even assisted in her funeral. And it seems somehow in this time in 1886, Saunierre, either through his brother, being in the location, being to whatever, was somehow linked to a whole bunch of these things that were going on at the time. And it's also known that Alfred was working very closely, like I say, with the Chef Bienne family. The Chef de Bienne family was linked with the Philadelphia Society, one of the original big Freemasonic lodges that was worked in at the time. There's a nephew of the Countess, Johann Salvatore, a member of the House of Hapsburg, who in 1889 changes his name to Johann Orth. Supposedly, he's claimed to do this to distance himself from his royal family. He didn't want to be a monarchy anymore. But oddly, between 1889 and 1890, just after he changes his name, Orth visits Rennes Le Chateau, specifically to meet with Saunierre. So why, if Orth doesn't want to be a part of the monarchy, why does he go to the very place that his family is funding a giant organization to Saunierre to? No one's been able to explain this. In fact, I think the French police had been following Orth around. it becomes very, very strange that, yeah, he was checked in by the police of Cuisa. They sent a report to the French Secret Service, who had been tipped off by the doctor of Esperanza, all trying to figure out what he's doing in southern France and why he's spending time with Saunierre. The French Secret Service then also watches Saunierre during this time. They actually arrested Orth and questioned him why he's in Rennes. And his excuse was he got lost heading to Spain from Italy and wound up in Cuisa by accident and just went to Rennes as a day trip. So it's almost impossible to get that far lost if you're going from Italy to Spain. Cuisa is not a place you would get lost, first of all. And if you were truly lost and looking for how to get to Spain, you would ask for someone for directions, not go off on a day trip to out-of-the-way Rennes Le Chateau, Nowhereville, France. So it's obviously a lie, and Orth is there for a specific reason. Most interesting, Orth is not traveling under his name, his new name that he had. He's traveling under a third name, Monsieur Guillaumes. And the suggestion for all of this is that the Hapsburg felt they were soon going to be dethroned in Austria, similar to how the French monarchs had been overthrown, that they thought there was going to be a revolution in Austria. And some have said they thought that maybe Rennes Le Chateau was a place for them to escape or retire to, and Orth may have been looking for a location for them. But again, you have to remember that that's not likely the case, because the bank in Perpignan had bank accounts for both Orth and Saunierre. According to Gerard de Sade, they even had, it has not been verified, but he claims they had consecutive account numbers, which would only be true if they opened their accounts together on the same day at the same time. And again, there's suggestion that Orth was there taking over the funding to Saunierre after the Countess de Chambord had died. Orth then charters a boat, and on July 13, 1890, he leaves for Buenos Aires, supposedly to sail around the Horn and to Valparaiso. Was never heard of again. Again, like all these stories, there's alleged sightings that somebody might have seen him here, somebody might have seen him there. He wasn't declared legally dead until 1911, but remarkably, from the time Orth sailed, the Hapsburg emperor made sure that the money was being set aside for Orth in case he was still alive, and as such, because money was still being transferred to Orth, normal money transfers could have still been going from Orth's account to Sauniere's bank account, even though Orth was dead, alive, wherever, or somewhere else. So I'm just keeping all this as a background for you, that we have this very strange connection between the Hapsburg monarchy and Saunierre. Take into account that it's the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the one who was going to succeed Franz Joseph, who was assassinated in Sarajevo to begin supposedly World War I. So don't discount that the Saunierre story might be very well linked into what was going on in World War I, another war that we again have no idea what the hell was going on. A few other pieces to keep you focused on. Another person to keep track of if you want to is a gentleman named Dr. Paul Courant, a very close friend of Henry Boudet, and he had been in Rennes Le Chateau since 1895. In fact, the garden in the center of town still carries his name. Not only is he Boudet's personal doctor, he's very close to Saunierre and acts as his doctor. And in fact, it is this particular person, this doctor, who is called to see Saunierre in January after he has his apparent stroke, and for some reason stays very close to Saunierre and Rennes Le Chateau even after his death. So I don't want to go into tremendous detail on him, but it seems like this Dr. Courant may have been given or was given or got a hold of tremendous amount of documents and information from Saunierre before he died, and took over large parts of the story along with Marie de Narnaud into the 1920s and the 1930s. There's another rumor, again we go back to Alfred, because remember Alfred died in 1906, but there's a rumor that Sauniere's brother had stolen a number of chef de bien documents and got them to Saunierre, who passed them on to this Dr. Courant on his deathbed in 1917. None of this is proven, none of it's sure what's specifically in these documents, but there is these weird thing where after Courant's death, The chef de Billon family had, and this is in a meeting document, I think of like the will reading or whatever, dated 1954, 03, 02, 1954, that the chef de Billon family had sought to reclaim the family archives bequeathed by Marie Louise, who died at Narbonne in May 1939, and the commission was embarrassed since the precious archives had disappeared shortly after the death of Dr. Courant, to whom they had been confided. So what these documents are, why Courant had them, why they seem to be stolen from Courant's home, you can look into all of this. Into Again, it's just too much to try to deal with here. There's many speculation that Saunierre is a Freemason and that everything that's going on is linking to that particular group. Again, Saunierre made 33 postcards in 1907, and 33 seems like an odd number of postcards to make. You would make 20 postcards, you'd make 40 postcards, you'd make 30, you would make 33 postcards. So it's things like that. It was the adding of the checkerboard floor. It's many different seemingly Masonic marks that are in the church that have led many people to believe that he's a Freemason. In 2007, I think it was, Antoine Captier, a son of one of the original people who had known Saunierre in the story, claimed to have found a Masonic collar belonging to Saunierre, one of the Scottish Rite of the 18th degree of the Rose Cross, I think, which indicates, and it seems probably true, that this was probably Sauniere's collar, and indicated that he did actually work with this lodge. There are documents in the 1900 that Saunierre attended at least 3 meetings of the Martinist Lodge in Lyon, which is a Masonic offshoot, and it's claimed that Rennes Le was the main place of the local meetings. Again, the chef de Billon family, as I mentioned, were the ones who created the Society de Philadelphius, which dominated the occult scene in and around Narbonne. So it's interesting that Alfred was directly connected with this very much key occult family, and how much were these two individuals connected with it. I'm just reading here I could go into detail. I've got like pages of detail. I just don't want to overwhelm you with the chef de Billon family and the Philadelphians and the Masonic Lodge. And I mean, please, you can read all that if you want to yourself. Another one you'd want to look into is something called Martinism, which is also very, very important potentially in the story. It's linked to a famous person named Pappus, who I'm sure you might know from creating tarot cards, associated also with the Protocols of Zion, and also from Carcassonne. So is another gentleman named Jules Daniel, right? Jules Benoit Stanislav Daniel, who became founder of a Neo-Cathar church in the Languedoc, became the librarian of Carcassonne, close friend of Emma Calvé, the opera singer that we had talked about. And Daniel wrote prolifically on Cathar thought and became the secretary of the Society of Arts and Sciences of Carcassonne. In this group, membership included Henry Boudet, although there's no direct evidence for it. Probably Saunierre was as well. But Daniel displayed tremendous amount of this thing called Martinism, this Martinist movement, started by Pappus, based on the teachings of a French mystic and philosopher, Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, who lived 1743 to 1803, and who took his philosophy from Jacob Boehme. And this was moved through Daniel, who was, of course, doing this exactly at the time Saunierre is working. And he came to believe that the Gnostics were the true religion and the origin of all Freemasonic thought. And it's claimed he had a vision, which he describes as the Aeon Jesus coming to him and calling for him to make a new church, anointing him as the Bishop of Segur and the originator of the Albigenesis. So Daniel began holding seances in order to contact Cathar and Gnostic spirits. And this whole idea of spiritualism and occultism and what's it called? What was it called at the time? Mentalism, not mentalism, where they're constantly trying to have seances and contact the spirits. This was very, very prevalent in this period at the end of the 1900s, and certainly, obviously, groups like Jules Daniel and this church he was founding was a big part of it. And again, was Saunierre and Rennes Le Chateau a part of what's going on there as well? By 1895, Daniel leaves the church just resigned from it, wrote a book called Lucifer Unmasked under the pseudonym John Costa. Now, again, remember he's writing this book about Lucifer Unmasked, explaining Lucifer, and it was linking back to Otto Rahn and what he's doing. So we're watching progression. We're watching threads that weave our way through this story. There's lots of talk that Saunierre was a Freemason attached to the a Grand Orient and the Martinist order, and that he had tremendous reverence for Albert Pike, the well-known Scottish 33rd degree Freemason. So I don't want to go into way more on this, but you can, again, I recommend, if this is interesting to you, look into Jules Daniel and the story. I'll make sure the name is in the what do you call it, the description box below the video, so you can look it up and you can go into details on him. But he's at this very same time. And you can also look up this guy, Dr. Gerard Encarnasse, who's known as Pappus, right, who believed to be a Gnostic bishop and was also organizing this Gnostic movement and connected to Tsar Nicholas II, and suggestions of whether he was connected to Rasputin and all these other things. And again, all these people are linked to the opera singer Emma Calvé. Why is Saunierre connected in the story to Emma Calvé? Probably is because of these occultist. I mentioned that there were these occult organizations. I'm just giving you a little bit of the names over top of it, of what you can look into if you want to go into more detail. I just don't have the time or the space to do that. The last little piece I want to add is something called the AA that I mentioned. It's another movement that's happening at the time, and no one has any clue what it is. One of the movements was known as the AGLA, and no one really knows what it was. But it seems to have been linked to some very strange organizations, perhaps a book, something like The Extravagant Mysteries of the Kabbalists, expounded in 5 pleasant discourses of the secret societies, which appeared in the 1670s and was a treatise on occult and elemental sex magic, banned in France but sold out several editions. And this group, whatever this AGLA or AA was, weaves its way as well through the story. This again, I don't want to. I have to put elements in the description box where you can go and look this up for yourself, of what this AA group might have been and how it was linked to the story. Don't forget that Bacon and Dee often used a secret. Francis Bacon and John Dee often used a secret AA logo, which some have claimed to be the Arcadian Academy of England. Others have claimed that it meant the Alpha and Omega, or Apollo and Athena. But this AA logo potentially goes all the way back and links to Francis Bacon and John Dee. And I just want to leave it there for you to kind of give you an overview that Saunierre's time at Rennes Le Chateau is intermingling with an explosion of occultist groups, various types of Freemasonic, non-Freemasonic lodges. The Golden Dawn is in operation, or the precursors of the Golden Dawn. Blavatsky's in operation. You've got this mass of things that are going on at Saunierre's time, and again, we're linking into, like I talked about, the stuff with Spain and with the other tower, and no one has any idea the depth of what's going on. We will be getting into the Holy Grail coming up in one of our future discussions. We will be getting into the discussion of what might be called sex magic and how that might be an important part of the story. There's lots of interesting and we'll just call them references, that this was part of the story that him and Marie de Narnaud were a part of, and some of what was going on at Villa Bethania during this time. How linked that is to these societies. Was Saunierre a member of the society, as a part of it? Was he just a face in the society? Was he there to try to learn something? Was he there to watch them? Was he there to spy on them? Who knows? Who knows how linked he was, but there does seem to be, for sure, links between Saunierre. And kind of the last part to keep involved as we go through the rest of the story is the parchments that Gerard de Sade has claimed were the parchments that Saunierre found. We know they probably weren't. They're the parchments that they made up for the book, but they wanted to get people focused on the biblical stories of the separating the wheat from the chaff, right? The story of the working on the Sunday, and more importantly, the manuscript with that talks about the rising of Lazarus, and this rising, this rising of, because that's what some others have suggested, that Saunierre is a black magician and that he's actually working on raising the dead, and that he's that he's working with that. The reason he was in the cemetery is that him and Marie were taking corpses and they were attempting to reanimate them and make the dead walk again. I mean, there's so many layers and so many possible ways you can go with the story. It all just has to be kind of presented to you and put on the table. But again, my feeling is Sauniere's just a small piece of a much larger story of southern France. It goes back into all of these mythological hermetic tales of treasure, of Arcadia, of the Grail, of the Knights Templar, of the Cathars, of the Normans, of the Celts, of the Gauls, of King Arthur and the Round Table, of origins, what I feel of the Jesus Magdalene story, of the New Testament, the Old Testament. All of this is interlinked in a giant, weird, soupy jigsaw puzzle. That the jigsaw puzzle pieces are not really smooth, they're like soup, and that they're very hard to locate, hold in your hands, and put together, but they're linked together, and only by going through more and more and more pieces of the story, deeper and deeper and deeper, can you start to unravel it. So I've talked to a long time with you here today, but I think you can see why there's a lot here to talk about. There's a lot here, to share with you. I knocked over a cup. Where are we headed with this? Well, we've got two more main subjects to go. One is the Holy Grail, and that will come next. I will talk to you about my research on the various elements of the Holy Grail, what it might be, what it's not, what the writers of it have to say about what the Holy Grail might be and how it links to the story. We have to go through a document known as the Serpent Rouge, and the Serpent Rouge is going to be a very challenging discussion. It's a document that appeared in the 1960s as part of these Lobineau documents in the Bibliothèque library in France. That is part of this odd documentation that showed up. But the Serpent Rouge is requires its own video. It's crucial to the story, and that will take us deeper into Saint Sulpice and some of the things we talked about in the 1960s, or in the 1600s, I should say. I may get into Notre Dame de Marciel. I don't know. It might just be too much. I may just have to just let you go into Notre Dame de Marciel, the church and the grounds there on yourself. And then we have to finish with like a giant overview and bring in the stories of Jesus and the Magdalene and John the Baptist and John and Peter and Gnostic Gospels and the Nag Hammadi documents and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and really try to give us an underlying roadway of where we can go when this examination is finished. So thanks for listening. It's been a long talk today. I didn't expect it to be this long, but I did want to get through all of my documents. Like I say, I've got like, I don't know, 50 or 60 pages on this material of what I just talked about, and I've shared with you just an hour of it. So there's lots you can go into if you feel like studying more of this on your own. For those of you who are also been researching these subjects, or these subjects go into other research you've been doing, drop it in the comments. We'd be interested to see if some of the things in this video stir up information, who you think Cagots are, what you think Otto Rahn might have found, any information you might see of how the Gauls and the Normans might be connected to the story, etc., etc. What if you know information on the AA or Jules Daniel or Pappas or any of this stuff. So thanks for listening. Thanks for your support. We're getting close to ending this series of chapters, and I have some new ideas of what to start working with you in April. I will be doing a video next week for you after Easter. My newest spiritual warfare video. There are some things now I want to talk about of where we are and where the world is heading right now, and I will put that in to a video next week. Again, I'll be reading Falling for Truth, and get you in with a Holy Grail reading sometime next week as well. So thanks for the support. Continuing to send some donations and things over to me. That's always appreciated. Sending information that's helpful, and going through, buying books, suggesting the book to others, suggesting if you think there's a really good place that I should be interviewed on, that would be great. If you have a connection and you think I would be great to be interviewed on a particular channel or podcast or whatever, by all means pass that along. And thanks. I guess this will come up on the beginning of Easter. I'm going to do some journeys this Easter. Sorry, I keep talking here. I'm going to be doing 3 journeys, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So I'll be following the biblical story in 3 dream journeys each of the 3 days. Friday going through death, Saturday being still in the cave, Sunday some sort of resurrection or transformation or a rising of some point. And I'm going to see how those journeys go, and if something interesting comes up that I think is worth sharing, I will share some of the information maybe in the spiritual warfare video with you. So I'll leave it there. Thanks for joining, and have a interesting Easter experience. Cheers.